morning to everyone. This is the first time for me to be in this lab. Probably like this is. I'm Moira Barbieri and I'm a resident up to the first year of specialty of gynecology and obstetrics. And I'm here just to talk to you about phase rectified signal averaging. Just a little bit introduction, and we know that the fetal heart rate is the result of an elaborate control that occurs at various levels, and as you know, is influenced by parasympathetic and sympathetic activity that allows the cardiocirculatory adaptation to the needs of the organism. Thus, variation in the fetal heart rate may indicate a lack of fetal well-being or an adaptation mechanisms. And so, for example, nutrients deprivation or hypoxemia can affect the autonomous nervous system, thus affecting also the fetal heart rate variability. And this happens both in the prepartum period and also during labor. And particularly during labor, the uterine contraction causes an intermittent but repeated deprivation of oxygen and hypoxemia condition, stimulating the autonomous nervous system to giving an alteration of the fetal heartbeat. So, over the last 15 years, CTG was the most used monitoring system to detect fetal hypoxemia or endometabolic acidosis, but it has, as you know, many limitations. First of all, low specificity and low positive predictive value in identifying fetal compromise. And moreover, and of important clinical significance, it has a high intra and inter-observer interpretative variability, thus affecting the rate of unnecessary intervention and other labor complications. So therefore, considering that the standard processing of CTG series has been found to be poorly correlated with important relevant clinical outcome, and that singular parameters also have shown to be poorly correlated with this relevant clinical outcome, a multi-parametric approach is forced by experts, and the new biomarker of fetal heart rate able to assess the fetal well-being are needed. So in this context, we found the PRSA, the phase rectified signal average. That is, well, I'm pretty sure that some of us knows about this technique, but however is a relatively new measure of fetal heart rate variability, and which is nothing fancy, it just computes the average of a growth time series, so providing two measures that are the cardiac acceleration capacity and the deceleration capacity from an interbit time interval. And on the figure you can find on the bottom the original signal, and on the right is spectrum, and below you found the PRSA here, and this is spectrum. This arrow stands for frequency peak, that, as you can see, are more clearly identifiable and recognized through the PRSA spectrum. Okay, so in 2014, probably we were one of the few groups that applied this technique to the fetal heart rate, collected from an animal model that was provided to us by the Martin Fresh group, and the model was based on, as you see before, on a fetal sheep which underwent a strict protocol of umbilical cord occlusion to mimic what happened during labor due to uterine contraction. So at each occlusion, we collected information about the fetal heart rate and the other parameters that Martin presented before, and then we compute acceleration capacity and deceleration capacity. And we found that the PRSA correlated with progressively increased during umbilical cord occlusion, and also that there were a correlation between PRSA parameters and biomarker of acid-base balance. Well, while AC and DC were observed to having similar values that are identical in stationary condition, when we have a non-stationary condition, for example during labor, AC and DC differs significantly. So we ask ourselves how to capture differences, and so we introduced another PRSA related quantity, that is the deceleration reserve. That is the sum between the deceleration capacity and the acceleration capacity. And then we tested the deceleration reserve all on the same animal model, and we applied the same protocol also to understand if there were any differences between the normoxic and the chronically hypoxic fetuses. And so we found that DR was different between the normoxic and hypoxic fetuses. The DR was lower in the population of chronically hypoxic fetuses. And moreover, we tested also the DR also for the identification of acidemia at birth, finding the same result. So we can say that DR seems to carry an interesting role in the risk stratification during the labor. So that's then basically we ask ourselves what leads to this diversity in the DR, and we answer ourselves that probably is lead to the deceleration morphology. So very recently we published a new paper in which we try to describe the morphology of the deceleration. We did a very simple analysis. Basically we take a deceleration and we put a trapezoid on it. And for sure this trapezoid had its own morphological parameters. And for example the baseline, then the amplitude, then the tau U, that stands for the time in which the fetuses reach the nadir of the deceleration, and also the tau R, that stands for the recovery, so the time in which the fetuses goes back to the baseline. Okay, and but from what was the rationale of our study? We know that during the labor, uterine contraction triggered the response of the autonomous nervous system of the fetuses, producing the deceleration. But under chronic hypoxia, the autonomous nervous system is known to regulate differently the deceleration, the fetal heart rate. So, different autonomous nervous system regulation might also lead to a change in the deceleration morphology. And so, after modeling the deceleration morphology on a trapezoid, we try to understand, to highlight any differences between the two populations. So, for both the chronically hypoxic fetuses and normoxic fetuses, we try to highlight differences in the morphological parameters of the trapezoid. And we found that the two populations are different, particularly for the tau U, that stands for the time in which the fetuses reach the nadir, and also for the amplitude and for the delta T. Well, then partial correlation coefficient were computed to compensate the amplitude and also the baseline. And here you can find an example of normalized fetal HH signal after this compensation. And as you can see, the red one are the hypoxic population, and they show a slower adaptation to the deceleration in respect to the healthy population. So it's true also the contrary. So the healthy fetuses decelerated faster than the hypoxic one. And therefore, we ask ourselves how to assessing these morphological parameters during labor, because it's really difficult. It's really challenging because of no stationarity, because of no signal noise, because of phase desynchronization. And well, actually we don't know, but we found that these parameters, these morphological parameters, are correlated with the PRSA parameters, both for the normoxic population and also for the hypoxic population. And so, in conclusion, we can say that the deceleration morphologies have been found to differ in normoxic and hypoxic sheep fetuses, that the same differences can be assessed also with PRSA parameters, and for sure this motivates future investigation of the translational potential of this methodology on human data, because we have only data on animal model, and the performance of this metric is still underway, so this is the first step of our work. Thank you.
Sure. Questions, comments, thoughts? I have a quick one. First, very nice graphics. I love the visual at the beginning. I don't know where it came from, but I tweeted it. It's on Twitter now, and this one is another really nice one. Where is this one from?
This is from internet, Google.
Maybe you should cite it. Yes. But it's beautiful. Yeah. So, what are you aware if your lab is planning any next steps with the PRSA, the CDA?
Sorry.
Any next? So, what are the plans? Are there any plans of continuing any of that work with this CDA?
We would like to do a lot of things. For example, try to understand if there is any differences between the population of chronically hypoxic, because we know that from a clinical aspect we are two types of intrauterine restriction, usually due to uterine uterine insufficiency. And so we would like to understand if PRSA is able to capture fetuses that are exposed to, that will develop an early restriction of growth, and then a late restriction of growth for.
Yep. Very much in Sylvia Lobmeyer. She was here. I think you were not here when Sylvia Lobmeyer was here. So she's done, if you don't know do you know who Sylvia Lobmeyer is? So she did a lot of this early work with PRSA in the early gestations for IUG earlier. So she was unfortunately here only the first day and didn't see her.
Thank you, Moira, for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm personally working since many years in monitoring antepartum CTG using also PRSA and associated parameters, and I confirm you that in most classifiers, the subset of parameters that provide the best classification, the best separation between normal and, for instance, UGR, pathological condition, contains PRSA, some PRSA-derived parameters. So I think what you and your group are doing is extremely important. We stopped in an antepartum condition. You work in this experimental data on sheep, particularly relevant, interesting in another condition, but I think it could be a parameter that can be added even translated in clinical. To CTG2 software we used is already included right now, so we are working with it. So any kind of validation could be important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. Any last thoughts, questions, comments? Thank you very much. So let me invite the last official speaker.